When we first started working on taking our multi-container application and importing it into the world of Kubernetes a couple sections ago, I had told you that we were going to create one separate configuration file for every object that you see in this diagram right here. I think in total we had something like 11 or so. So that means that we're going to have 11 separate files sitting inside of this K8s directory, and each one of those separate files is going to create a separate piece or a separate object that's going to be running inside of our overall cluster. Now, at some point in time, it might seem like having to work with all of these different configuration files might be a little bit overwhelming. Everything that we've done up to this point has very clearly said that we're going to make a separate file for each object. But if it feels like that's just too many files for you to have to kind of manage and deal with, I want to tell you about one different way in which you can organize all of these different configuration files. So, rather than putting a separate file for every separate object we create, we can actually combine different sets of configuration down into a single file. So as an alternative way of organizing your config files, rather than saying, okay, I need a file for cluster IP and a file for deployment, we actually can create one single file that contains all the configuration for both a cluster IP or a service and the deployment that it is associated with. There's no limit to the number of different pieces of config that we can stick into a single file, so you do not necessarily have to say, oh, this service is going to be in the same file as this deployment. We could just as easily say one single file is going to hold all the config for both these services and both these deployments. I'm going to give you a very quick example of how you would combine these different config files together, and then I'll tell you why we are not doing that inside this course. Okay, so let's say, for example, that we want to kind of co-locate all the configuration for our deployments and services that are tied to each one. So in other words, we might want to kind of consolidate the